everybody, my name is In Jin Moon. Welcome to iHome Church. For those of you joining us for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our email list. Today, I want to share a little story about my visit with a friend of mine that I've known for a long time. And this person came to visit me, and one of the questions that this person said was, how do I really learn to have a relationship with God? Because I'm waiting for God to reveal himself or herself to me, but I'm just not seeing the signs. Well, when this question was asked of me, it reminded me of the book of Samuel's in the Bible. And of course, the book of Samuel's is an incredible tale. In that one of the most famous stories, the fight between David and Goliath, come from the book of Samuel's. And the interesting thing about these books is it's often treated as a historical text with very little theological implications. But if we understand the purpose of these books, which is not to just provide us with mere facts of what took place in terms of the history of how things went down. But these books, the purpose of these books is to really prove witness to God working together with us in his providence. And, it clearly makes a statement that God overturns the usual arrangement of power in this world, and that the book starts off with Hannah's song and ends in David's song. And basically it takes this woman, Hannah, who is a barren woman, but through God's working, she is able to give birth to a prophet who becomes a kingmaker. And we know that David, the eighth son of Jesse, is anointed by prophet Samuel. And he is the man who is to become a man after God's heart. And so we realize that in these books, the constant message that the Bible and the writers of the Bibles are trying to convey to us is that the future of Israel is in God's hand. And God is actively working and supporting and inspiring the Israelites to believe and work together with him in partnership, and in so doing accomplish the providence that is at hand. And I think for lots of us, the story of David and Goliath really hits home, because the personality or the character of David really kind of triggers the desire to root for the underdog in all of us. We see him described as an adolescent, probably a really scrawny kid, basically taking it upon himself to come face to face with this monstrous Goliath that the Bible describes as being 6 cubits on a span long, basically meaning that he is almost 10 feet tall. Or in some of the other books, such as the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, it gives us probably a more accurate description of him, the Goliath, being 4 cubits and a span tall, meaning he would be somewhere slightly less than 6 feet tall. But back in those days, when the average height was somewhere around 5 feet, he would have definitely been cutting out an imposing figure on the battlefield. And this, the interesting thing about David is, obviously, in terms of physical, visual attributes, he is sorely lacking to be somebody who is combating or going to be fighting with this gigantic Goliath. And it describes him, coming onto the battlefield with a bronze helmet, with an armor coat made of mail, which basically means rings of metal. He has bronze shin armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin across his shoulders. So can you imagine taking a look at this monstrous, gigantic man on the battlefield, totally outfitted with all of this metal, probably glistening in the sunlight, creating death fear upon anyone who gazed upon his incredible form? I would think that if we were to try to understand what that would be like, would be maybe coming across something like a RoboCop, that fantastic movie about this basically a robot human, and can you imagine coming across something like that? Wouldn't that put fear of death in all of us? It certainly would to me. But this young man, face to face with this, RoboCop of sorts back in those days, had the strength and the character and the courage to see him through to a victorious end. And so when we ask ourselves, well, what is it about this character that just continues to fascinate us all throughout history, and probably will continue to do so way into the future? Well, not only is he an underdog of sorts in terms of his physical attributes, but I think what God is emphasizing in the story of David and Goliath, particularly in the character of David, is really about the perfection of his heart. Perfect in that he is to become a man after God's heart, as it says in the Bible. And he truly unites with what God wants of him. Not that he is obeying a commandment. God didn't appear to him through the form of a burning bush, basically saying to him, like the way he did to Moses, saying, "I command you to put yourself before Goliath and be victorious." We don't really know what exactly went on, how God revealed himself or herself to David. And I think a lot of us, who are always waiting for God to reveal him or herself to us, we're always saying, well, God never really calls me. God never really called me to be anything significant. God never really called me to become something great. And so I'm just going to wait I'm just going to procrastinate and see how things fall, and then maybe see what I'm going to do. Well, the truth of the matter is, whether we recognize or realize it or not, maybe because our spiritual sixth senses have been clouded by doubt, disbelief, and just sheer inability to accept that God is a part of our lives. But the important thing to realize is that God calls us all the time. It's almost as if God is calling us on our iPhone. But we are the ones that did not turn our phones on. And we are the ones basically asking God, well, why did you not leave a message? And we are the ones basically saying, well, why are you texting me when I wanted something in the mail? So many times we're making excuses for why God didn't send his message, or God didn't convey his direction or his advice in our life. But if we really stay true to our hearts, God is speaking to us all the time. And so I very much envision that God probably maybe came in David's dreams, or through a voice, or through a whisper in the wind, in the beautiful summer day. There are many, many ways that God might have whispered or might have advised David to do the right thing. But the incredible thing about David is that he volunteers. In other words, he is proactive. He is actually in partnership with God, allowing God to tap into his potential of what a great king he could be, and therefore contribute greatly to God's providence. He volunteers against people who reject his leadership. They just cannot see him as a leader to fight against something like Goliath. And sometimes in our lives, our greatest discouragers tend to be people that are very, very close to us. Eliab, his oldest brother, basically reproached him and said, "What do you think you are doing, David? You know, who asked you to come? Where are the sheep that you are supposed to be tending to in the wilderness? Who is taking care of them? And why are you so presumptuous? And I see the evil in your heart." It's kind of interesting how Eliab uses these words, presumption, that you're acting on presumption, and that there is evilness in his heart. Many times, it's usually the one who accuses another person of these things that are actually guilty of the crime. Presumption in that Eliab saw David having no authority of sorts. But if Eliab truly understood that David was the anointed son, and God wanted to work through him, what he was saying to David, basically saying, well, you should not be here. He was the one acting without authority. And he is the one with the evilness in his heart, or the jealousy in his heart, not being able to understand that God, when it came to his family, is going to work through the youngest son, David. And so if Eliab could have really kind of supported the younger brother and really, basically helped him prepare for battle, that would have been a wonderful story of how two brothers work together to bring tremendous victory. But many times the test that comes our way in life is through somebody that we like to think that we love. And many times it's the members of our family that are discouraging us from responding to the call and questioning the purpose for our volunteering, or for being proactive, or wanting to respond and do the right thing. And of course, even to King Saul, who finally gave him the permission to go and fight Goliath, he had to prove himself by telling him that, I am the one who defeated lions and bears with God's help, because God was with me. And so by recounting the story of his victory against a lion and a bear, he was clearly trying to persuade King Saul that God was with him, and God will be with him throughout this battle as well. And so even though he might have looked scrawny and skinny, and even when King Saul wanted to dress him in his armor, it must have looked quite ridiculous in that he didn't have the kingly form. The armor did not fit him. And of course, he ended up going as himself. But the interesting thing is that David, regardless of how many people laughed at him or told him that he had evilness of heart and he was acting presumptuous, he felt called. And so regardless of what people say, he is going to volunteer and be there responding to God's call. In essence, what David is doing by volunteering, it's an act of extreme humility, in that the attitude of his mind comes from a humble place. Through his humility, David is able to receive God's calling and respond accordingly by volunteering. In our principled way of thinking, David is taking control of his 5% responsibility. We believe, Father teaches, that God does 95% in our lives, but we have 5% that we have to be responsible for. And so by David volunteering, he takes ownership of the 5%, and regardless of what people say, he volunteers because he feels called. And what else does David do that I find extremely fascinating? Not only does he volunteer, but he acts quickly. When he comes on the battlefield against this robo cop, type of a vision, what he does is he runs quickly towards Goliath. It's the total opposite of what our, brain is telling us. You need to get yourself out of here because you are going to be cremated by this monster. But what he does is totally the opposite of what our natural instinct would be, is basically to take flight when you are face to face with something like Goliath. But he runs quickly and he obeys immediately. In other words, David does not allow himself the room to basically talk himself out of it. How many times do we feel like we know the right thing to do? This is the right thing to do. But because of our fear of something that might happen to us, we might lose our job, we might lose our position, we might lose our friends and family or whatever. We know it's the right thing to do and God is calling us to do it, but many times we talk ourselves out of doing it by procrastinating and hesitating and basically expectorating or spitting out the very blessing that God wants to bring to our lives. David doesn't give room for that. He has decided that he is going to volunteer. He has decided that he's going to take Goliath on. And there is no room between his thought and his actions because he is united in heart with God. So without being able to talk himself out of the right thing to do, which many of us have done in the past, he runs towards what I'm sure looks like sudden death to people who are watching this battle as if we were watching a movie. He runs towards Goliath and does not give himself the room to hesitate or procrastinate. So he volunteers, he acts quickly, and what does he do? That is incredibly important. Well, David puts his trust in God. He is there in the battlefield with only a sling and 5 little rocks that he's carrying. And to me, it's these two things, these two items that he has in his possession, face to face with this monstrous Goliath, is very symbolic of different things that are taking place in David's life. The rocks, even though they may only be like pebbles, small rocks, they are rocks nonetheless. They may look scrawny, they may not look like a powerful weapon, something that one would like to use against an enemy like Goliath. But in many sense, a rock can symbolize somebody's faith in God. It doesn't matter how small. As long as the faith is there, God is going to work through that rock to make things happen in our life. And so David was not discouraged by the size of the rock, but he had absolute trust in God. Basically, he was saying to himself, it doesn't matter the size. The only thing that matters is that I have these rocks that represents my faith in God, and God will see me through. And the sling, in many respects, for me, kind of symbolized the state of the Israelites at that time. They were so overcome by the visual monstrosity of Goliath that the battle was already defeated even before it got started. The battle was defeated because they got scared, and they said there is no way that we can be victorious in a battle like this. And when God is looking at the Israelites, he's looking at the Israelites as if these men are broken. Their hearts were broken. And that's why David says in 1 Samuel chapter 17:32, let no man's heart fail in light of the Philistine. what David was saying was, do not be broken in your unity with God. But because these men's hearts were broken in unity with God, they simply could not believe that God could work through their people to deliver them from Goliath. But David was saying, look, we can do this if we remain united. And so for me, the sling represents not just something that David was carrying over his shoulders, but we wear it when we break our arm or when we break our leg. We usually have a sling around our arm, or many times if we break our legs and we are basically committed to a bed, and it's the sling that is supporting our broken bones. So God is kind of, supporting these broken hearts or broken bones of the Israelites and say, come on, you can do this. David is my representative. I have anointed him to be a victor, and you need to unite with me. Do not fail in your heart. So by these two things, these two items that David goes out to the battlefield to confront the great Philistine Goliath, God is basically telling the Israelites, no matter how small your faith might be, continue to believe. Do not let your hearts fail. And even if it fails, I am the sling that will see you through. And ultimately, of course, we know in the story that David takes that little pebble and uses the sling, takes that faith, that's symbolic of the faith of Israel and himself, and uses the support and the spiritual workings that God has been preparing to ensure this victory, and shoots that pebble straight into the forehead of Goliath and slays him in battle. And so this is an incredible tale of an unlikely hero armed with the trust in God that brings incredible victory to his people and to the people that have doubted him in his abilities. Because we realize through this story that God is not only telling us what happened in the battle between David and Goliath, but God is teaching us the kind of a artistic attitude, or what I called heartitude, that one should maintain in our life of faith. And that is to realize that God, as our Heavenly Parent, is calling us all the time. And we need to listen. And we need to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to the words that God sends our way. And instead of complaining that the messenger is all wrong, or you didn't send me the symbol that I was waiting for, or the person that you have sent is absolutely the wrong person for the job. It really doesn't matter what we think, because God did his or her part. God delivered. God called. And it is our responsibility, or our 5% portion of responsibility, to heed the call, respond with a grateful attitude, with a spirit of volunteering, with a spirit of really taking charge of our lives, being proactive, and going forth. And knowing that God is with us all the time. Push aside the fear. Push aside the different things or the static in the air that might prevent us from doing the very thing that God wants us to do. So it's an incredible story of empowerment, of inspiration, and for me, it's a nice kind of a story to read from time to time, because many times the biggest battles that we have ongoing is the battle inside our mind. It's the monster inside our mind monster Goliath in our mind, basically telling us, you are unworthy, you are not good enough, I reject you, you are a social outcast, you are worthless, your insecurities are too pronounced. I mean, all of these things that prevents us from becoming an inspired men and women of God. We hear these things in our mind all the time. And it's kind of interesting how the name Goliath sounds like the word go, and lieth. It's almost like when we are confronted with this incredible monster, this vision of terror flickering and shining in the sunlight on the battlefield, ready to kill us. It's almost as if the name Goliath means you or me, we gotta go, and lieth means basically prepare our burial ground, because the monster means harm. And it's basically telling us, instead of being a proactive and an inspired and an empowered men and women of God, you're worthless. You're not good enough. You will never amount to much. In a way, the monster in our head is telling us, Goliath, disappear, because you are unworthy. You're not good enough. You're a reject. But what the story of David and Goliath is telling us, what God wants us to hear, is that you are prepared. I love you as my son and daughter. Do not look at yourself through the lens of the world, but look at yourself through my eyes. It doesn't matter how the world perceives you. Maybe you might feel like a social outcast. You might feel like you're a failure. We might feel like we don't belong. But do not let yourself see you or me through the lens of the world, but see yourself through my eyes. And through my eyes, you are infinite, infinitely beautiful. You are an eternal divine being that I expect wonderful things from. And all you need to do is volunteer. So many times I like to remind myself, whenever I am confronted by that inner obstacle, or my mind telling me or putting doubt out with what I really need to do, then I tell myself, or I remind myself, don't let Goliath make you Goliath in your despair, in your misery, or in your own sense of worthlessness. And another thing I say to myself is, I've got to David. Meaning, I've got to be like David in dealing with my id. And of course, the id is that part of the psyche where inherited instinctual impulses can be found. So don't let the monster tell you, Goliath. Overcome the monster in our head by accepting and being united in God's heart, with God's heart, by realizing that God is with us all the time, and God is calling upon us to really work together as a partner to bring great, great victories for Providence. And it's a great reminder for me, the story, to always Dave my id, in that it reminds me of these certain characters or qualities that the character of David had, which was his ability to volunteer and to act and trust in God. And it helps me overcome a lot of the difficulties in my life. So I hope that this sermon can help you in your life to overcome your Goliath, and also to help Dave your id. And I hope that as we move forward, we can really take ownership of our lives by not just sitting back and just letting God do all the work, but being that responsible young adult, if you will, that begins to take responsibility by volunteering and acting and actively trusting in God. And if we do so, then great things can happen, just like the way great things happened for David on the battlefield against Goliath. So, with that said, have a great week and a fantastic day. Bye-bye.
They say everything can be replaced. They say every distance is not near. Yet I remember every face of every man that put me in. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. And any day now, I shall be released. They say every man must need protection. They say every man will fall. But I swear I've seen my reflection someplace so high above the wall. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. And any day now, I shall be released. Yeah. Down here next to me in this lonely crowd, there is a man who swears he's not to blame. All day long I hear him shout it out so loud, crying out that he's been framed. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. And any day now, I shall be released. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, I shall be released.
If you have any questions and comments, please leave them below the video or go to our webpage, injinmoon.com, and use the contact form. And don't forget to subscribe to our email list. In that way, we can update you on all the happenings at iHome Church. Thank you. Take care.